Every other scroll found in the caves above the Dead Sea was written on animal skin or on papyrus. One was not. One was hammered into sheets of copper, riveted together, and rolled up like a blind. It is not scripture. It is not a prayer or a psalm or a rule for a community. It is a list of places, 64 of them, and beside each place a quantity of gold or silver and instructions for how far down to dig. Nobody has ever found any of it. Here is the ground we are going to cover tonight. How a sheet of corroded metal came out of a cave in 1952 and could not be opened for 4 years. What was done to it in a workshop in Manchester in order to read it. What the list actually says in its own words. And the 3 explanations scholars have offered for it, none of which is comfortable. We will go gently. There is a great deal of nonsense attached to this object, and we are going to leave almost all of it outside. Start with the cave, because the setting explains more than the treasure does. Above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, the cliffs are soft marl and limestone, riddled with holes. In the winter of 1947, a Bedouin shepherd found jars in one of them, and inside the jars were scrolls. Over the following 9 years, 11 caves in that one small area gave up somewhere near 1,000 manuscripts, most of them in fragments no larger than a hand. They are the oldest copies of the Hebrew scriptures in existence, 1,000 years older than what we had before. That is what the Dead Sea Scrolls are, and it is why they matter. Cave 3 was found in March of 1952 by an archaeological team rather than by shepherds, which for once means we know exactly what was where. The cave had a collapsed roof. Under the fallen rock were the remains of 40 storage jars and a scatter of parchment fragments, ordinary in every way. And at the back, lying against the wall, apart from everything else, were 2 rolls of copper. They were green. Copper corrodes to a hard oxide skin, and 2,000 years in a limestone cave had turned the metal to something closer to a mineral than to a sheet. The 2 rolls had once been a single strip, about 8 feet long and a foot high, made of 3 sheets riveted end to end. You could see writing on them. The letters had been punched into the metal from the front, hard enough to raise them on the reverse, and along the outer edge of the roll, a few words stood out. What you could not do was unroll it. Copper in that condition does not bend. It cracks, and each crack takes a line of text with it. So the object sat. For 4 years it sat, in Jerusalem and then in Amman, while people who wanted very much to read it argued about how. And here is the question this whole story comes down to, so put your answer in the comments before you hear mine. Is a list this precise, cut into metal at enormous effort, the inventory of a real treasure, or a memory of one that people wished had survived? See whether you still think the same thing by the end. Before we come to the reading of it, it is worth knowing how carefully that cave was found, because it changes how much weight the object can carry. Cave 3 was not a chance discovery. By 1952, the scrolls had become the most valuable manuscripts on Earth, and archaeologists had lost patience with buying fragments from middlemen. So a joint expedition, run by the Jordanian Antiquities Department with the museum in Jerusalem and the French Biblical School, walked the cliffs for miles and searched more than 200 caves in a matter of weeks. That is why we can say with confidence that the copper came out of the ground in that cave, in that position, alongside those jars. Almost nothing else in this field is that clean. And a year later, before anybody had opened it, a scholar in Germany worked out roughly what it said. Carl Georg Kuhn at Heidelberg was shown the outer surface of the roll, where the punched letters had raised bumps on the reverse of the metal that could be read in the right light. From a handful of visible words, he proposed that the document was a list of hidden valuables with places and weights. He was reading the back of a closed book through the cover, and he was right. Consider what somebody in the 1st century had to do to make this. Parchment is cheap. A scribe with a reed pen and a prepared skin can write a long document in a day, and everything else found in those caves was made that way, because that is what writing normally is. Copper is not cheap. The sheets have to be smelted, hammered flat, trimmed and riveted. Then every letter has to be driven into hard metal with a punch, one character at a time. The metal itself was analyzed once the strips were cut, and the result is quietly telling. It is almost pure copper, with only about 1 part in 100 of tin in it. That is not the ordinary bronze of the ancient world, which carries far more tin and is harder for it. Somebody chose a soft, nearly unalloyed sheet, and a soft sheet is chosen for one reason. It takes a punched letter cleanly without splitting. In other words, the material was not what happened to be lying about the workshop. It was selected for the job of being written on by a person who had thought about what they were doing and what it was for. Whoever ordered this did not want a copy. A copy is quick. They wanted a thing that would still be legible when everything made of skin and reed had rotted. That is the single strongest argument in the whole debate, and we will come back to it because it cuts against the tidiest explanation. Now, how do you read a metal document that cannot be opened? The first proposals were chemical. Soften the oxide, reduce it back towards metal, unroll it slowly. Every version risked destroying the raised letters, which were the only thing anybody actually cared about. The scholar who pushed hardest for a solution was John Marco Allegro, a young English lecturer in Semitic studies at Manchester, and one of the small international team appointed to publish the scrolls. Allegro took the problem to a colleague at the College of Technology in the same city, an engineering professor named Henry Wright Baker. This required a decision by the Jordanian Department of Antiquities, and it was not a small one. They were being asked to let a national treasure leave the country and be cut into pieces by a man none of them had met, on the promise that it was the only way to read it. They agreed. The 2 rolls were flown to England, and for a while, the most important unopened document in the Middle East sat in a technical college in a rainy industrial city. Baker's answer was not chemistry, it was a saw. He built a rig that held the roll rigid and coated the surface with a resin to stop it shattering. Then he cut the scroll from the outside in along its length with a very fine circular blade. He did not unroll it. He cut it into 23 curved strips, each one a section of the original cylinder, each one readable on its inner face. The detail that stays with me is the resin. Before a blade touched the metal, the whole surface was coated so that the corroded copper would hold together as it was cut, because the real danger was never a bad cut. It was the object coming apart into flakes and dust while the saw was still moving. He cut a fraction of a millimeter at a time, with the roll held on a spindle, easing the blade through metal that had the consistency of a biscuit and the value of a small building. It took him weeks, in 1955 and 1956, and the technique has been criticized ever since by people who were not in the room and did not have to decide. But it worked. The letters survived the cut. Everything we know about the copper scroll, we know because an engineering professor in the north of England agreed to saw a 2,000-year-old artifact into strips. And what emerged was, in the flattest sense of the word, an inventory. 12 columns of Hebrew, about 3,000 characters in total, which is not many. The whole text would fit comfortably on 2 pages of a modern book. The Hebrew itself was the first surprise. It is not the careful literary Hebrew of the biblical scrolls. It is the everyday Hebrew people were actually speaking in the 1st century, the kind you find in the Mishnah, with the spelling of a clerk rather than a scribe. The entries are formulaic, and once you have read 2 of them, you can read all 64. A place, a direction, a depth, a quantity. Then the next place. The first one runs like this. In the ruin that is in the valley of Achor, under the steps going eastward, 40 cubits, a chest of silver and its vessels weighing 17 talents. That is the pattern for the whole document. No story, no explanation, no name of any owner and no date. It reads like something written by a person who already knew what the treasure was and simply needed to record where it had gone. And that, before we get anywhere near the gold, is the thing to hold on to. This is not a text written to be discovered. It is a text written to be consulted. There is something else in the text that most retellings leave out, and it matters more than any single entry. The scroll contains mistakes. Letters formed wrongly, spellings that shift from one column to the next, and in a couple of places, a word that appears to have been started, abandoned, and punched over. A man cutting letters into metal does not compose as he goes. He works from an exemplar in front of him, and he makes the errors of a copyist rather than the errors of an author. Which means the copper is not the original. There was an earlier version of this list, written on something ordinary, and the copper is the durable edition of it, made deliberately later by somebody who had decided the information had to outlive the material it was on. That single observation rules out the idea of a spontaneous act. Somebody made a decision about permanence and then paid a metalworker to carry it out. So where are the places? Some of them are named in a way that ought to be helpful. The Valley of Achor, Mount Gerizim, the Kidron Valley. Sekaka, which many scholars think is the settlement at Qumran itself. A few hundred yards from the cave the scroll was found in. Others name a landmark that has simply not survived. The tomb of Zadok, the house of the 2 pools, the great cistern in the courtyard of the peristyle, the mouth of the spring of the house of Hakos. That last one is interesting, because Hakos was a priestly family, and the book of Ezra puts a man of that family in charge of weighing the silver and gold brought back to the temple. Directions are given in cubits and in paces, and always from something the writer expected to be standing there, under the steps, in the corner, beneath the threshold, in the northern hole of the mouth of the pit. Which is the whole problem in one sentence. Every direction in the document is measured from a landmark that no longer exists. If you are told to walk 40 cubits east from the steps in the ruin at Achor, and nobody today can say with certainty where the valley of Achor is, let alone which ruin, the instruction is perfect and useless at the same time. Take a few more entries, and the texture becomes clearer, because they are not all treasure in the pirate sense. In the cistern below the rampart, on the eastern side, in a place hollowed out of the rock, 600 bars of silver. In the tomb of the third course of stones, 100 bars of gold. And then, several times, something that is not money at all, vessels of offering, priestly garments, jars containing tithed produce. Things whose value is that they are consecrated, not that they are precious. That mixture is a serious piece of evidence. A treasure legend accumulates gold because gold is what a legend is for. An inventory accumulates whatever was actually in the building, including the linen. Group the locations geographically, and a second pattern appears. They cluster around Jerusalem and around Jericho, with a scatter in the wilderness between, which is precisely the corridor a party carrying valuables out of the city would move along. Then there are the quantities, and here the document becomes hard to believe. The weights are given in talents, the standard large unit of the ancient Near East. A talent is roughly 70 or 75 pounds, depending on which standard is being used, and the scroll does not say which. Take the entries at face value, add them together, and the totals come out at something in the order of 25 tons of silver and 65 tons of gold. Sit with that for a moment. 65 tons of gold in the 1st century, buried in caves and cisterns around Judea in 64 separate lots. That is not a fortune. That is a national reserve, comparable on some estimates with the entire gold holding of a wealthy ancient kingdom. And this is where a great many careful scholars simply stop and say, no group in 1st century Judea had that. The numbers are not credible, and a document with incredible numbers in it is a document telling a story. There is a counter-argument, and it is technical rather than dramatic. Nobody knows for certain what the scroll's unit actually was. If the symbol being read as a talent is instead a smaller unit, or an abbreviation, the totals fall by an order of magnitude or more, and the figures become perfectly ordinary temple deposits. We do not know. That is the honest position, and it will be the honest position at the end of this video too. There is one more oddity, and it has never been explained. After 7 of the entries, in the middle of the Hebrew, somebody has punched 2 or 3 Greek letters: Kappa Epsilon Nu, Chi Alpha Gamma, Theta Epsilon. They are not Hebrew. They are not numbers in any system that fits. They may be the initials of the men who did the burying. They may be a filing code, tying those 7 caches to a second document. 70 years of scholarship has produced no agreed answer to 7 small groups of letters, which tells you something about how thin the ground is under all of this. The most sober suggestion is also the dullest, and it is probably right. Greek was the working language of administration in the Eastern Empire, and a Greek abbreviation next to an entry is what a filing reference looks like. 7 of the 64 caches were cross-referenced to something. We simply do not have the something. So, 3 explanations. They are not equally likely, but each of them is held by serious people, and each of them accounts for something the others cannot. The first is the one everybody wants. This is the treasure of the temple in Jerusalem, hidden as the Roman army closed in. The date fits uncomfortably well. Paleographers put the writing somewhere around the middle of the 1st century, give or take 50 years, which puts it in the same generation as the Jewish revolt against Rome that began in the year 66. Jerusalem fell in the year 70. The temple was burned and stripped, and what the Romans carried away is not a matter of speculation, because they carved it on a monument. The Arch of Titus in Rome shows the golden table and the great lampstand being paraded through the streets. But a temple is not only its lampstand. It held tithes, the annual half-shekel paid by every adult Jewish man in the empire, deposits held in trust, and vessels by the thousand. The Mishnah describes chambers and treasuries, and men whose whole office was counting. If you knew a siege was coming, and you had months of warning, hiding that in 64 places across the wilderness, and writing the list on metal is not a fantasy. It is exactly what a careful treasurer would do. There is even a precedent inside the tradition. The second book of Maccabees tells of the prophet Jeremiah hiding the tent, the ark, and the altar of incense in a cave on the mountain before the first temple fell, and sealing the entrance so that nobody could find the way. It is also worth being clear about how much money passed through that building, because modern readers tend to picture a church rather than an institution. Every adult Jewish man in the empire paid a half-shekel to the temple each year. Not a collection, an obligation, gathered in communities from Babylon to Rome and carried to Jerusalem under guard in convoys that were an event in themselves. Josephus, writing within a generation of the destruction, describes a treasury of enormous size and describes the Romans finding so much gold in the province afterwards that the price of it fell across the Eastern Empire. In Rome, the great amphitheater, begun a few years later, carried a dedication that has been reconstructed from the holes left by its bronze letters. The most widely accepted reading is that it was built from the spoils of war, and the war in question was that one. So the question is not whether such quantities existed in Jerusalem. They did, and Rome took a great deal of them. The question is only whether some of it left the city first, and whether this list is where it went. There is a fourth possibility, less often heard, which sits between the others. The temple was not only a sanctuary, it functioned as a bank. Private individuals deposited money there for safekeeping, precisely because it was the most secure and most respected building in the country. The second book of Maccabees mentions deposits held there belonging to widows and orphans, and treats their protection as a matter of honor. If that is what the scroll records, then it is neither the sanctuary's own hoard nor a legend. It is a register of other people's property, held in trust, dispersed for safety by officials who fully intended to give every item back. That would explain the clerical tone. It would explain the vessels and the garments alongside the silver. And it would explain why somebody thought the retrieval instructions were worth writing on metal. The second explanation is quieter. The scroll belonged to the community at Qumran itself and lists that communities own wealth. It was found in their caves. One of the named places, Sekaka, may be their own settlement. The Hebrew is the Hebrew of the region. The difficulty is the amount. The people at Qumran, on the current understanding, lived plainly and held property in common in a settlement that housed perhaps a couple of hundred people at its height. 65 tons of gold does not belong to them by any reading. Unless, of course, the unit is wrong, or unless what they were holding was not theirs. The third explanation is the one most of the original editing team came to, and it is the least satisfying. It is folklore. Joseph Millick, the scholar assigned to publish the scroll, concluded that it was a legend written down. A list of a treasure that never existed, of the kind that attaches itself to a destroyed sanctuary in every culture, given weight by being cut into metal. In favor of it, the absurd quantities, the vagueness that is not vague at all until you try to use it, and the plain fact that nothing has ever been recovered. Against it, and it is a heavy weight to argue against, is the copper. Folklore is written on cheap material, because folklore is copied and told and copied again. Nobody smelts sheet metal and punches 3,000 characters into it by hand in order to preserve a story they know is not true. If you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel, and there is a new one every day, walking through the life of Jesus. Because what came next is the part of the story that gets forgotten, and it is the part that should make anybody cautious. John Marco Allegro, who had arranged for the scroll to be cut open, believed the treasure was real. Between 1959 and 1962, he mounted expeditions to look for it, funded partly by a British newspaper. He dug at sites in the Jordan Valley, at Qumran, and at a spot near Jericho where he thought the Valley of Achor could be identified. He was thorough, and he was working from the best readings then available. He found nothing, not a coin, not an empty chamber that looked as though something had been lifted out of it, nothing at all. Allegro's later career went badly in other ways, and his name now carries baggage that has nothing to do with the copper scroll. But the expeditions were serious, and their result stands. Since then, there have been others. Private searches, funded projects, men who became convinced they had matched a line of the scroll to a piece of ground, and who dug with permits and with equipment and with cameras. One searcher spent decades on it and became convinced he had located a chamber near Qumran, announcing at various points that he had recovered temple incense and the ashes required for a purification rite. The claims did not survive examination, and the excavations were eventually stopped. Another project, worked up from a detailed remapping of the scroll's directions onto the ground around Qumran, persuaded the authorities to allow test digging in the 2010s. It produced pottery and the ordinary debris of a settled site, and nothing on the list. The pattern has been consistent: enthusiasm, a plausible identification, a dig, and no treasure. That is not proof the treasure was never there, but it is a long run of nothing, and honesty requires saying so plainly. It is worth understanding why the odds are so poor, because it is not simply that the directions are vague. Judea has been continuously occupied for the whole 2,000 years since. Roman engineers rebuilt it. Byzantine monks quarried into the same cliffs and lived in the same caves. Crusaders fortified the ridges, farmers terraced the slopes, and modern building has gone over a great deal of it. Anything hidden 40 cubits under a step has had 200 generations of people digging foundations, robbing stone, and ploughing fields on top of it. And here is the part that closes the argument off completely. A hoard found in the year 300, or 800, or 1100 leaves no record whatsoever. It is melted, spent, and gone, and the finder tells nobody because the finder does not want to share it. So the silence of the ground can never settle this. Absence of recovery is exactly what we would expect whether the treasure was fiction or whether it was found and quietly sold in an age before anybody wrote such things down. There is one more thing the scroll tells us about the people who made it, and it is the part that has stayed with me longest. The revolt against Rome was not, to the people inside it, a doomed last stand. That is hindsight. At the time, it was a war they expected to win, or at least to survive. 60 years later, a second revolt broke out under Bar Kokhba, and the letters and contracts from that generation, found in caves further south, show the same instinct exactly. Deeds, keys, family papers, wrapped and hidden in rock by people arranging their affairs for a return. They did not come back either. The caves kept the paperwork of two failed homecomings, 60 years apart, and in both cases what survives is not a lament, but an inventory. That is what the copper is. It is not a message to us. It is a note left for a colleague who was expected to arrive shortly, in better times, with a spade. Meanwhile, the object itself has had a quieter second life, and it is the part of the story where actual progress has been made. The scroll never went back to Israel. Cave 3 lay in territory administered by Jordan in 1952, and the 23 strips have stayed in Amman ever since, where they are displayed in the National Museum. In the 1990s, a French team took on the conservation and made high-resolution casts of every strip, reproducing the punched letters exactly so that scholars could work on a copy without touching the metal. Those casts produced better readings than the originals had ever given, because a cast can be lit from any angle and a corroded surface cannot. Words that had been guessed at for 40 years were settled. A new critical edition followed, and several of the place names changed. Not dramatically, but enough that some earlier searches were looking in places the text does not actually specify. That is the honest shape of progress here, not a discovery. A slow improvement in what the sentence says, which is the only kind of progress this subject is likely to offer. So what is left when the treasure hunt is set aside? Something better, actually, because the copper scroll tells us a great deal that has nothing to do with gold. It tells us that ordinary Hebrew was alive and in daily use in 1st century Judea, written by people who were not scribes, in a form we can read. It tells us that whoever wrote it expected an emergency to end. You do not bury property in 64 locations and write a retrieval list unless you expect somebody to come back for it. This is not the document of a people giving up. It is the document of a people planning to return. And it tells us in its own flat clerical way what those people valued enough to save: silver, gold, and vessels. Over and over, vessels. The furniture of worship, recorded by a man who was counting rather than grieving. There is one last entry, and it is the one that stays with you. At the end of the 12th column, after 63 other locations, the scroll gives its final direction. In the pit adjoining on the north, in a hole opening northward, buried at its mouth, a copy of this document with an explanation and the measurements and an inventory of every single item. The scroll's last act is to point at another scroll, a duplicate with the explanations the copper version leaves out. Whoever wrote this knew perfectly well that a list of landmarks would not be enough on its own. So they made a fuller version, and they hid it, and they told this document where. That second scroll has never been found either. And because the copper version is the durable edition of an earlier document, that missing companion may be the very thing the metal was copied from, described from memory, by a man who knew he was writing the only version anybody would be able to read in 100 years. Which leaves the whole enterprise resting, at the last, on a pit somewhere north of a place we cannot identify. So back to the question, an inventory or a memory? Here is where the evidence honestly sits. The material argues for truth, because nobody spends that much effort on metal for a tale. The quantities argue for exaggeration, unless our reading of a single unit is wrong. The silence of the ground argues for nothing at all, because the ground has had 2,000 years to be quiet. What is certain is smaller than the legend, and in its way, more moving. In the years when Jerusalem was about to be taken, somebody sat down and made a careful, unhysterical list of what had been carried out and where it had been put. They wrote it on the most permanent material they could obtain, in the plain language of everyday speech, with measurements, so that a stranger arriving years later could find it all again. Then they put it at the back of a cave above the Dead Sea, under a roof that would eventually collapse on top of it, and it lay there while the temple burned, while Rome fell, and while the language it was written in stopped being spoken in the streets. And it was still legible when it came out. Whatever else is true or not true about the copper scroll, that much is not in dispute. The one thing in those caves that was made to survive did survive, and it is the one thing we still cannot read our way to the end of.